Thanks a lot.
Okay, so let's start right into it. First of all, not everyone can get into an Ivy League education, so what's the truth about acceptance rates at these schools? How hard is it?
Yeah, I mean, these schools are extraordinarily selective, and in a lot of cases, less than 10% of the students who actually apply wind up getting in. And along with being incredibly selective, they're also incredibly expensive. So these are going to be among the most expensive schools in the entire United States, and in some cases in the entire world.
Okay. Now, with that expense, this is what we're going to go into. What are the pros and cons, and is it worth it? Hopefully we can answer that question by the end of this show. Let's go through some of the pros first of accepting an admission to an Ivy League school, assuming you can get into one. The first is a high endowment.
So, I mean, one thing generally to start this off is Ivy League was originally started as a sports league. So this was not meant for schools of academic excellence. It just so happens these are among the oldest schools in the country. And because of that, they've gotten the greatest level of prestige, and in a lot of cases, they've accumulated the greatest amount of wealth. So these schools have, in some cases, tens of billions of dollars that are just sitting in the bank, and they can use that for a whole variety of initiatives. They often use it to hire big-name professors. So if you go to an Ivy League school, it's not going to be uncommon to see someone on TV and then have them teach your class later that day, or to have the person who wrote your textbook be in the class with you. They can also have a greater reach in terms of recruiting students. So Ivy League schools are known for having students from every part of the world that they actively go out there and get the best and brightest to come into the classrooms. So that does help learning.
So that diversity of talent can sort of lead to better learning, I suppose.
And you're going to find that at all schools, but particularly the Ivy League schools, they excel in that particular area.
Now, those endowments, damaged horribly by the financial crisis, I imagine.
Absolutely.
And yet they're still pretty rich compared to other schools.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, endowments have lost up to 30% of their net worth, but that's been universal across all colleges in the country. So proportionally, you still have $20 billion plus endowments for some of the top Ivy League schools, where in smaller schools, you're going to see $500 million to $1 billion.
Which makes me wonder, why do they have to charge so much?
That's what a lot of people say.
Of course, more monetary resources leads to, I imagine, better professors, better classes in general.
I mean, and another thing that students find are these Ivy League schools have more money for research and for interesting summer programs. So students at an Ivy League, if you want to spend the summer researching the homeless issue in Guatemala, you're going to be more likely to get dollars to go out there and try that yourself, which is definitely a perk.
Okay, don't worry, guys. We're going to get to the cons. But you have another pro, which is that you have the Ivy League brand and the alumni network that comes with going to an Ivy League school. And a lot of people in power do tend to be from Ivy League schools.
Yeah, and that is important, especially if you're considering going all throughout the United States in your career or if you're going internationally. There are some great schools in America that don't have the same name recognition. But going to an Ivy League school, no matter where you are, people know that brand, they associate it with you for the rest of your life. And when you do graduate, you enter into a very powerful alumni network who may be willing to help you out throughout the entirety of your career.
So you are paying for that name.
In a sense, some people have said, would you spend $100,000 just for a diploma with that name on it if you couldn't take a single class? Some people would say yes.
Wow. So it's not just necessarily about the quality of the classes, it's also the name recognition. All right, now moving on to some of the cons that come with all these pros. And first of all, the obvious downside is the amount of competition in these schools.
Yes.
And to get into these schools.
In a lot of cases, it's incredibly competitive to get in the first place. And then once you do get in, you're competing against some of the best and brightest kids in the entire country. Now, that might not fly with your personal learning style. You may prefer to compete against yourself. And in every test and paper, you're getting the A because you want to get the A, not because the person next to you is kind of feverishly competing to try to make sure they get the A and you don't. In some of these Ivy League schools, they've seen books being vandalized in the libraries. It tends to just be a little bit more cutthroat, so you want to make sure that academic environment is right for you.
And they're grading on a curve in a lot of these classes, so it might matter. And I wonder if it's better to get an A+ in an average school versus a D in an Ivy League school.
And that's an important question to ask when you visit schools. Do you grade on a curve? Some schools do, some don't, but the ones that do, you're quite literally, for every grade you get, competing with every one of your classmates. So that definitely has a certain atmosphere.
All right, now another con you list of Ivy League schools is limited studies and majors, meaning just because it's a big-name school, it doesn't mean it's necessarily right for you, depending on what you want to study.
And that's a really big point, that you shouldn't go to a school just because of how highly it's ranked in U.S. News and World Report. you should figure out, what do I want to major in, and how strong is that department at each of these Ivy League schools? It may be that you want to be a creative writing major, and they don't offer that major, or that major is not particularly strong there. So a state school or a cheaper school may be right for you. Another thing people say, these professors at Ivy League schools will often be big-name professors, but that doesn't mean they're the best teachers. In some cases, they're more concerned with their own research than they are with teaching students. So you want to be aware of that. Another thing is, Ivy League schools are very traditional. So the more experimental majors, things that are Web 2.0, social media, you may find that at some state schools or some smaller private universities. You may not find it at an Ivy League school as readily, or more interesting experimental programs that let you study abroad as part of the curriculum, or that give you work as part of the curriculum. You're not necessarily going to find that in Ivy. So
it's important not to be charmed by the name necessarily, and really look at what your course of study is going to be, what you want to do in the future, if you know that when you're 18.
If you're going to spend this much money, you want the right fit, and you want the place you're going to learn the most.
In this segment, Jordan joins me again to answer some viewer questions. All right, so Jordan, the first question comes from Jill of New York, and she writes, how can Unigo.com, that's your website, help students choose between Ivy League colleges and other types of colleges? What info you guys got?
One thing that's unique about Unigo is we typically get at each student body, at each college, about 5 to 10% of the students review their school. And then you can sub-search. So you can say, only show me reviews of Harvard written by English majors, or African-American female students, or students from Ohio. So what you can do is see what students who are just like you think about both Ivy League schools and cheaper schools, state schools, private schools. Because what's really important is not, again, that you look at that school's ranking, but that you see what do students like you appreciate the most, and where do they live and learn and appreciate the experience the most. So Unigo is going to let you compare that and find that out.
Now, if you got into an Ivy League school, let's go back, and you were making this choice. What things would you consider? Do you think you would have considered going to an Ivy League school?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at, no matter what type of school, you have to look at the price tag, clearly. You want to look at, does it have a core curriculum? There's some Ivy League schools that have giant core curriculums. There's some, like Brown, that have no core curriculum at all. What's the character of the student body? It's these same essential questions. Where is it located? What's the size of the school? That's really going to impact your experience, and you want to have a handle on in advance.
You still didn't answer my question. You just went ahead and dodged that. All right. I won't put you on the spot. Here's another question, this one from Mark of Long Island, New York. And he writes, what if you really want to go to an Ivy League college, but you're really afraid you can't afford the price tag? What do you recommend? Now, I know a lot of these schools do give scholarships on a need basis. So.
And that's important here. You shouldn't not apply because you're afraid that you ultimately won't get enough financial aid. Apply, see what the financial aid package looks like, and then based on that, what most people don't realize is schools tend to have a one-time financial aid reevaluation policy. So you're actually allowed to go down to the financial aid office and say, look, this is the amount of money you awarded me. This isn't enough. And here's why I think it isn't enough. Here's some personal factors you may not have considered. And they'll reevaluate it on the spot and may give you even more money. So I would say apply, see what they give you, and then talk to them if that's not enough. Don't be afraid to apply.
Sure doesn't hurt to apply. And this leads to the next question. James of Waterbury sends his question via Facebook, and he asks, in the same vein, are there any programs that help low-income students afford Ivy League colleges?
Yeah, there's actually a website called projectonstudentdebt.org, and this groups together Ivy League colleges and other highly selective colleges that a couple years ago implemented a new policy where if your family makes between $120,000 and $180,000, these Ivy League schools, including Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, Stanford as well, you only have to pay 10% of your annual income for tuition. So regardless of what the sticker price is, if you make between 120 and 180, it's 10% of your income.
But a low-income family would make way below that. So what are the options for that?
A lower-income family, in some cases, don't have to pay anything at all. So Project on Student Debt goes school by school of these participating universities, and they break it down into what's your income level and what sort of breaks and advantages are these schools offering.
And there's also government loans for I understand, for people that can't afford a school that they get into.
Yeah, and there's lots of different repayment plans. So if you decide that, you know what, I can't afford it now, but I don't want to be right out of college and drowning in debt, there are 30-year repayment plans, there are 10-year repayment plans, so you could figure out a plan that works for you.
Okay. We have a couple of tweets that came in, also with similar questions about finances. The first is from Ari of Santa Monica, California. She's like, what are the best websites to find college scholarships? Are there any websites you recommend specifically?
Yeah, I mean, we have some information on scholarships on unigo.com. Fastweb.com is one of the Internet's biggest repositories for college scholarships. And one of the things that's great about scholarships are, it's not just for all students. A lot of times they get very specific.